Hello dear listeners. Welcome to your channel. This is the summary for Sabbath School Lesson 12 for the fourth quarter of the year 2025. Thank you for liking this video and sharing it with your friends and acquaintances. The title of this lesson is, God is Faithful. The memory text is found in the book of Joshua chapter 21 verse 45. Not one word of all the good promises that the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass. At the end of this lesson, you will hear the song related to this verse. Dear listeners, the lesson opens by highlighting Joshua's final moments as Israel's leader. Like President Kennedy's inaugural speech, Joshua's farewell words carried immeasurable weight. As he neared the end of his life, Joshua gathered Israel's leaders to remind them of two great realities: God's perfect faithfulness in the past and Israel's responsibility for faithfulness in the future. Joshua's first speech, found in chapter 23, looks forward, calling Israel to worship God alone, to honor His covenant, and to guard their identity. This week's study reflects on how God kept every promise made to Israel and how His faithfulness becomes both the ground of our hope and the call for our obedience today. Sunday lesson. All came to pass. The summary verses in Joshua 21 verse 43 to 45 stand as one of Scripture's strongest testimonies of God's reliability. Joshua emphasizes that every single thing the Lord had promised, all came to pass. The text uses the word all repeatedly to show that Israel's victories, their inheritance, and their peace were entirely the result of God's initiative, not their military strength. Just as Canaan was a gift of grace, so our salvation is God's gift, not something we earn. Paul affirms the same truth. Even when humans fail, God remains faithful because He cannot deny who He is. This assurance gives believers confidence that just as every promise to Israel was fulfilled, every promise of God concerning our salvation and eternal future will also be fulfilled without fail. Dear listeners, how does God's faithfulness in keeping His promises give us confidence that none of His promises for the future will fail? Monday lesson. A sign of concern. Although the land had been allotted and God had given Israel rest, Joshua reminded them that their future success depended on continued loyalty. Their position in the land was not a once-for-all guarantee. It required obedience and faithfulness. Joshua spoke as an old man who had witnessed God's victories firsthand, reminding the people that the Lord, not they, had defeated their enemies. But some nations still remained, and Israel's victory would only continue if they relied on God. The lesson connects this with our spiritual life today, teaching that Christians overcome not by their own efforts but through Christ's victory on the cross and the power of the Holy Spirit. Yet despite God's abundant promises, human hearts still struggle with sin because victory requires continual dependence, not self-confidence. God has given rest to Israel from its enemies, but there are some nations left that still have to be dispossessed. Victory is not an accomplished, unchangeable reality for Israel but an ever-present possibility by constant reliance in faithfulness on God's available help. Tuesday lesson. Clear boundaries. Joshua shifted the focus from military battles to spiritual boundaries. His greatest concern was not the strength of the remaining nations but the danger of their influence. Israel's greatest threat was friendship with idolatrous cultures, not the sword. By adopting the values, customs, and gods of the surrounding peoples, Israel would lose their identity and loyalty to Yahweh. Joshua warned them not to invoke the names of foreign gods or form marital bonds that could open the door to spiritual compromise. The lesson recalls that Joshua's concern was not ethnic purity but spiritual purity. His warnings echo into the New Testament, where believers are urged not to be unequally yoked with unbelievers. The challenge for today's Christian is finding a balance, remaining in the world to witness and serve, but resisting the pull of the world's values and idols. Joshua's warning against harmful associations inevitably leads to the question of the Christian's relationship to the world. How can we find a balanced relationship with the society that surrounds us? Wednesday lesson. The anger of the Lord. Israel already has experienced the Lord's anger during the wilderness wanderings as well as in the Promised Land and was fully aware of the consequences of provoking Yahweh's anger by flagrantly breaking the covenant. Joshua 23 ends with solemn warnings. If Israel broke the covenant and turned to other gods, the same divine judgment that fell on the Canaanites would fall on them. Scripture's language about God's anger can be unsettling, but the lesson explains that God's wrath is not emotional rage. It is His holiness confronting sin. Throughout Israel's history, disobedience repeatedly provoked consequences, not because God delights in punishment but because sin inevitably leads to destruction. The Bible presents God as gracious, patient, and compassionate, yet unwilling to overlook evil. In the New Testament, Jesus bears God's wrath in our place so that those who trust in Him no longer face judgment but receive life. Thus, the reality of divine wrath makes God's love even more profound and His justice trustworthy. Thursday lesson. Cling to God. Joshua urged Israel not merely to avoid idols but to cling to God with the loyalty and affection of a covenant relationship. This same verb describes marriage, deep, personal, committed. Joshua reminded Israel that up to that point, they had indeed remained faithful, but history would soon show how quickly the nation would drift when this devotion faded. The call to love the Lord your God is not about forced affection but about a heartfelt response to God's goodness. Love for God is a chosen commitment rooted in relationship, gratitude, and trust. In the New Testament, Jesus expands this concept by commanding believers to love one another just as He loved them, a command both old and new, rooted in God's eternal character but revealed more fully in the life and sacrifice of Christ. The command to love God also expresses the mutual, but not symmetrical, nature of divine love. God desires to enter into an intimate, personal relationship with every person who reciprocates His love. Thus, His universal love to all constitutes the framework for the manifestation of our voluntary, mutual love. Friday lesson. Further thought. Ellen White reinforces that God's warnings are expressions of His justice, not harshness. To excuse sin would undermine the entire structure of God's government and fill the universe with confusion. Divine love and divine justice cannot be separated. Sin brings suffering, and only Christ's sacrifice makes escape possible. The discussion questions challenge us to identify evidence of God's faithfulness in our own lives, to understand the biblical teaching on God's anger within the context of His love, and to consider how to engage with the world without losing spiritual identity. Finally, the lesson calls each person to examine the barriers that keep them from clinging wholeheartedly to God, the only source of true security, rest, and faithfulness. God bless you.
Not one word of all the good promises that the Lord hath made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass. Not one word of all the good promises that the Lord hath made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass. Joshua chapter 20.